So last but not least, we have Carlos Martinez.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thanks, David, and thanks very much, Yanan. Thanks very much, Paul, for really interesting insights so far. I'll try and keep it brief. It's an interesting conversation, China and climate change, because on the one hand, China's got a reputation, at least among Western politicians and among Western journalists, as a sort of climate criminal, right? China is, and has been for the last 15 years or so, the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases. I think it's responsible for around 30% of all greenhouse gas emissions. China still burns a lot of coal and so on. And a lot is made of that. It is important to introduce a bit of context there, that China's a massive country of 1.4 billion people. So if you look at its per capita emissions, they're actually very normal. It's kind of around the median, similar to the levels of Iceland, similar to the levels of the Czech Republic, and half the levels of those of the United States, half the levels of Canada. And of course, China is still a modernizing, developing, industrializing country. It's the workshop of the world, right? And if you look at cumulative emissions, so because greenhouse gases stick around in the atmosphere for hundreds of years, if you look at the greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere right now, the United States alone is responsible for a full 25% of those, in spite of having only around 4% of the world's population. China's responsible for 13% of the cumulative emissions, in spite of having a population of around 18% of the global total. So, it's very important to contextualize this conversation about China as a climate criminal by saying that this is a crisis that was created by North America and by Europe. Nonetheless, it's obviously very handy for our politicians and for our journalists to blame China. As has been outlined by the previous speakers, China is in fact making remarkable progress, which is increasingly very difficult to ignore. When China is responsible for 50 or 60% of all solar energy production on the planet, when it's responsible for 60, 70% of all wind power production on the planet, then you can't ignore it unless you really, really, really want to. So increasingly, it feels like the environmental movement, at least, is trying to understand that, okay, if we want to save the planet, if we want to prevent crossing these various ecological tipping points, if we want to prevent climate catastrophe, we have to pay some attention to what China is doing, and we have to work with China. China's in a position where it's been described by Erik Solheim, who's a former Norwegian Minister for the Environment and a former United Nations Under-Secretary General. He describes China as the indispensable country for everything green. And Pablo Ginarte, the representative from the Cuban embassy in the introduction this morning, described China as the global engine of the green transition, which I think is a good and a fitting phrase. Coal use is still relatively high in China, as was mentioned by Paul and by Yanan, but it's gone from over 80% a couple of decades ago to under 50% now. And according to the International Energy Agency, China's investment in renewable energy and its innovations in renewable energy technology has been such that the cost of solar power, the cost of wind power globally has decreased by 70 to 80%, to the point where if you're building a power station somewhere in the world now, particularly in the global south, it's likely cheaper, more cost effective for you to use solar power or wind power rather than fossil fuels. China has 95% of the world's electric buses. It's got more high-speed rail miles than the rest of the world combined. China has 40,000 kilometers of high-speed rail miles and growing, and that compares with Britain's 113. So it compares sort of fairly favorably. Chinese electric cars make up 60% of worldwide sales. China is the world leader in forestation, so China's forest coverage has gone from around 12% a few decades ago to around 24, 25% now, so it's literally doubled during a period where in most of the rest of the world, forest coverage has decreased. China is also a world leader in biodiversity protection, animal conservation, and so on. Meanwhile, in the West, we talk about climate change a lot, we talk about environmentalism a lot, we talk about saving the planet a lot, but we're not actually doing very well. If you look at what's happening in the US, in Britain, in Europe, in Japan, in Canada, we've made precious little progress. Various governments have committed to getting to net zero by 2050. But to be frank, and sorry to break it to you, it's sheer fantasy. Trump has just pulled out the Paris Agreement for the second time. In as much as there has been a reduction in emissions, like there has been some level of reduction in emissions in Europe at least, that's basically a function of exporting emissions to the global south and China. It comes along with exporting industry, exporting manufacturing around the world. It's not that we've made any compromises in our living standards, or that we've made any serious innovations when it comes to renewables. And meanwhile, we're failing, our governments are failing, our economy is failing, our big businesses are failing. But we're in this sort of neoliberal hellscape where the blame is individualized. It's our fault. And if you want to save the planet, then you have to take really short showers, and you have to travel less, and you have to recycle more, etc. No more burgers if you want to save the planet. And meanwhile, our governments, we look the other way while Israel drops white phosphorus on Gaza, and similar environmental crimes that are taking place as part of this genocide. We replace Russian gas with US fracked liquid natural gas, which is cooled to minus 70 degrees below zero, and then shipped across the Atlantic. I mean, from an ecological point of view, it's an absolute disaster. And there's lots of talk of Green New Deals and all the rest of it, and we have successful radical left politicians that put forward the Green New Deal, so that it's sort of part of the conversation, but everyone knows that it's considered as this fringe, mad, radical idea that's never going anywhere. Meanwhile, in China, it's literally happening. They're rolling out a Green New Deal on an unprecedented and kind of almost unimaginable scale. So, the capitalist West is failing while China is succeeding. And, I just want to conclude by talking about a little bit like why China, why is China making this incredible progress? Why is China putting this huge effort, these huge resources into the project of preventing climate breakdown, protecting the natural environment? And, my thesis, not to give it too grand of a term, is that, it must be related to the class character of the Chinese state. It must be connected to the fact that the capitalist class in China, the people who own and deploy capital, are not the ruling class, and they don't get to call the shots, and they don't get to define the overall trajectory and priority of the economy. There's no fossil fuel lobby in China. You don't have CEOs of oil and gas companies saying, no, we better avoid all of this investment in renewables. China's got an essentially planned economy. Even the private sector is heavily regulated. The banks are publicly owned. When the big banks are publicly owned, that means that investment decisions are made on the basis of the public interest and on the basis of medium and long-term interests, and not just short-term interests. So you've got this priority of people and planet over profit. And to my mind, that is the fundamental reason that China has emerged as the undisputed leader in the fight against climate breakdown. The fundamental reason is its socialist system, and that's a lesson to take away, right? Only socialist planning can effectively address the crisis our planet faces. And to end with a quote from Guillaume Suing in a book that's published by Iskra recently called Communism, the Highest Stage of Ecology, he says, "Relying on capitalism to save our environment is like relying on arms dealers to ensure world peace." Thank you very much.
Thanks to Carlos and all the speakers for fantastic contributions. And just to summarize, in that China represents a different path from the suicidal one America and the West has in terms of their energy policy and their environmental program. Telling China's ecological story is like an existential importance. So take this away with you, tell your friends. Okay, so thanks so much, everyone.